Hello, everybody. Welcome to ICC's Game of the Week with your host, as always, Joel Benjamin. When an uncompromising wind-seeker meets the rabbit of the field, we can expect fireworks. Hikaru Nakamura went after Francisco Vallejo with his usual gusto in round 5 of the Grand Slam final, which was contested in two halves, one in Sao Paulo and the other in Bilbao. Now, Vallejo fought back aggressively with a sacrifice, but not to be outdone, Nakamura found a counter-sacrifice to usurp the initiative. Well, let's have a look at this slugfest. Nakamura playing white, Vallejo black, and Nakamura opens with c4. Now, we know that he's ready to play pretty much anything. He plays both e4 and d4. I think in more recent times he's been more of a d4 player. But like a lot of grandmasters, he's willing to play c4. And Vallejo plays a line against the English, which certainly a player might think that as an area to attack him in. And that is namely this move bishop c5. Now it's a somewhat respectable, if offbeat, variation. But generally, black likes to wait for that knight to be on f3. This is something you play probably more against knight f3 than against g3. And the reason is that white can play e3 and knight e2 against this setup, and that seems to work very well against the bishop. And we see that here, a6 making room for the bishop. And there's the aforementioned e3, which blunts that bishop's diagonal, and also maybe white will play for d4. Now, Vallejo had played this earlier in the tournament against Ivanchuk, and there he retreated the bishop to a7 right away, perhaps anticipating the advance d2 to d4. But in that game, Ivanchuk went for the plan of rook b1 followed by b4, and certainly that advance there looks pretty solid with the bishop on the long diagonal. Looks like white gets some nice pressure there, so maybe Vallejo wanted to avoid that. That game ended in a complete disaster for him. Ivanchuk won very decisively. So knight e7, and in this case we see the pawn to b3. We will see that Nakamura has ambitions elsewhere on the board. Now the bishop goes back, fianchetto. Rook to b8. This might be preparing the advance b5, and also sometimes it's just a good idea to, number one, get off that long diagonal of the bishop on g2, and also in some variations the b7 pawn may need defending after the bishop on c8 moves. So white plays d3. Perhaps b5 is better move against the pawn going to d4. So Vallejo kind of goes a different direction. Bishop f5, developing that bishop, although the bishop can potentially be a little bit of a target to be attacked here. Queen d2. Nakamura is playing kind of a flexible way. And now h3. It's very typical in the English opening that white will play this move to avoid a trade of bishops. For instance, if white, let's say, castled bishop h3 to trade them, that would be kind of nice for black. For one thing, the bishop on g2 is really pretty unopposed in this position. It has a very nice long diagonal. And also, this bishop on f5, as we see the move h3, the bishop is getting kind of squeezed and maybe a little target for the pawns. And also, if that bishop is traded, maybe black will consider throwing his f-pawn forward. Now, note that when white plays such move h3, with the bishop and queen lined up, he's renouncing kingside castling, at least for the moment. Very often, it will become possible through some later moves, but as we see here, Nakamura is prepared to follow through with queenside castling. All right, so Vallejo is the first to castle, and Nakamura plays f4. So we see Nakamura beginning actions in the center before deciding where his king is going to go, and also it creates possibilities like g4 to g4, g3 to g4, trapping the bishop. So Black has to respond to this move, and so the bishop comes back to e6, which makes me wonder a little bit what the bishop was doing on f5 in the first place, but I'm sure that there were reasons for going there at the time. Now Nakamura, as is his style, plays aggressively, creating threats with a threat of d5, not too worried about his king in the center just yet, although he will need to get out of there soon. Well, here after d4, it seems to me that the simplest and most obvious test of White's aggression is just to take and play d5. It seems quite logical. I'm not sure what Vallejo didn't like. If White plays c5, I guess Black can break that up with b6. Don't think that White can really maintain that chain and keep the bishop out of the game. And also either there or, well, at any moment, g4 can always be answered by f5. So the bishop on e6 isn't in any real danger. So e takes d4 would have been the simplest move, but Vallejo plays a more complicated way with knight f5. And, well, I could see that this move would be attractive. It actually sets up some tactics, certainly. Not only a threat of taking on d4, but perhaps a threat of knight takes e3, followed by e takes d4. Now, first obvious question is, what about d5? I think that Black would probably take knight takes e3, and d takes e6, really the only test. And now Black has a couple of continuations, knight takes g2, king f1. Now the knight is lost anyway, so Black probably gains a little time with knight e3, queen e3, and now f takes e6, let's say, opening up the f file. So my queen f3 could be answered possibly by knight e7, the idea of knight f5, and bringing that knight into attacking position. Here White would be a piece up, but Black has a couple pawns, and the White king is not in a safe position. And to say certainly Black has compensation, maybe very much sufficient compensation. Alternatively, Black doesn't necessarily have to take the bishop. He can just take back on e6, let's say with the queen. And after the bishop moves, he can look to open the e-file. The White king is kind of stuck with the Black knight on e3. It's really hard to move that away. So it's no surprise at all that Nakamura didn't like that continuation, but instead he plays bishop takes c6, right? A rather non-stereotyped reply, because that bishop has been White's pride and joy for the early part of the game, but he parts with it in this situation, and Black is not in a position to take with the queen, because now d5, White essentially gains a tempo to take that piece off. So Black recaptures with the pawn. That, okay, creates some weakness in Black's structure. And now castles. If g4, one fairly simple response would be knight h4, which threatens a fork on f3. So first, White castles, but now seriously threatening g4. And the knight goes back, so White gains a little momentum here. So White is developing, I think, a nice space advantage here. I can see this h-pawn advancing, further cramping black and maybe creating some possibilities of opening up kingside lines or maybe opening up the long diagonal with an advance of pawn to h6. So black is in danger of being slowly squeezed here. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting to me. The computer seems to think black is doing fine here, but it looks to me like black really needs to take action if he doesn't want to get squeezed. So that's what Vallejo does. He pushes with a5. And now h4. Well, in hindsight, maybe another prophylactic move might have been in order. But Vallejo presses on a4. And now the surprising bishop takes c4. And now c5 attacking the knight. So because of that, black is in a position to start getting compensation for the piece, not attacking the knight, but also rook coming to b4 is in the air. So knight came back to c3, and from there it might go to b5. So black doesn't want to get his rook blocked out, decides to hop in with rook b4. All right, now white has various options, but it's not easy to stamp out black's play. For instance, if d takes c5, black might double on the b file, attacking the bishop. Now queen b5 threatens a checkmate on b1. And in this position, we see a whole lot of open lines against the white king. White might still very well be better in this case. Computer indicates king b1 keeps some advantage, but it's always scary in a position where you have no pawn cover whatsoever in front of your king, and your opponent's heavy pieces are really free to roam. So, well, it was almost like a mantra for Nakamura in this game that he was going to try to keep some shelter for his king to prevent the black heavy pieces from really going after him. So he started with the move queen to d3. Now after c takes d4, he had a very interesting alternative to what he played with bishop a3. Now if the rook goes back, knight b5, and black could play something like c5. And, d5 is coming and so on, and black is going to get some very real play on the queen side. Now, when you consider the future of this bishop, how things turn out, you can understand why Nakamura didn't want to leave with it. But on the other hand, after knight b5, Vallejo plays a very nice move d5. Now, if c5 instead, then Nakamura can gain some momentum on this rook, and I think perhaps queen c2 or queen b3, and white has made some consolidating moves. There's a little bit of a blockade going on. White can get some useful moves in before black attacks. So the continuation of the game, d5, I think really gained a lot of time for black to push things forward. White took on a7. It's a bishop that's not particularly useful, especially after the advanced c5. Black is certainly happy to trade it off, and white is not in a position to maintain his knight. So c takes d5, queen takes a7, and now the rook is kicked back, and queen c4. You see the queen sets up shop in front of the c5 pawn, blockading it, at least for the time being. Now we know that queens are lousy blockaders, so this is, nothing permanent in any way. All right, so Vallejo plays knight c8, looking for knight d6, check, king h8. Now at this moment, there's a very cold-blooded possibility for white. Queen takes c5. And this gets approval from my computer. And one line that it gives is knight takes d6, rook he1. First of all, that prevents rook c8 because white can take that and mate on the back rank. So the line continues queen b7, queen takes d4, queen c7 check. And the reason the queen checks and not the rook is black is again conscious of possible back rank mates. Now if knight b5, white can give back a piece to get into an ending. Bishop g7, and white is just a few pawns up, and his king is a lot safer with the decreased material. So to bishop c3, rook c8, king d2. Yeah, this is a computer line. Rook b3, rook c1, rook d8, bishop a1, knight e4 check, rook takes e4. White has a whole lot of material for the queen, probably a winning advantage. Does that mean that Nakamura should have played queen takes c5? Well, I wouldn't say so. A computer can calculate all the possibilities and decide that it's safe to play such a move. And of course, if white doesn't get mated, he can enhance his advantage by taking some material. It would improve his computer score. But people don't think that way. In a practical game, no grandmaster can feel entirely safe, can feel certain that he's not going to checkmated when he has completely open lines against his king and his opponent has all his heavy pieces. So Nakamura is determined to really keep some shelter for his king. It's a very practical approach, and we see it bear fruit in a few moves. So first thing he does is he goes d7. Now black takes that, and you think, well, how did that really improve matters? Well, when white plays rook h2, the idea is that now if knight d6, queen d5 is slowing black down a little bit. Note that rook h2 is an extremely useful move for white because, first of all, it adds defense to the bishop on b2, and the rook is ready to come to c2, which is giving more shelter for the king. When you don't have conventional shelter of pawns, you have to, make artificial shelter of pieces. So Nakamura is trying to slow him down a bit. So queen b7 was played to prevent queen d5 and, well, also to build pressure on the b file. The rook came over, and rook b5. So now black is getting ready to play knight d6, and then there's all kinds of potential in the black position, maybe tripling on the b file, maybe breaking the blockade at some moment by pushing forward with c4, possibly knight e4 can be a move. So it looks like black has a lot of potential in this position. But it's also true that at this moment white is a piece up, and actually only a piece up for only one pawn. And Nakamura finds an excellent counter strike to give back the piece to really transform the position. And that's this move, knight takes f5. Very well played. So after rook takes f5, rook takes d4, utilizing the pin. Black can't take the rook because queen takes knight is going to mate on the back rank. So suddenly we get a look at the position. We see, okay, white is no longer piece up. But first of all, he's killed those connected passed pawns. He's opened up the d file for his rook. His rooks are now working very effectively in the center and shielding his king. And he's basically cut down this knight on c8, which is going to have a much harder time activating than it was a move ago. It's ready to jump in knight d6 and be very effective. Also, this bishop on b2 now has a wide open diagonal, and with the onrushing kingside pawns, we're going to see the black king actually be in big trouble. And we can really see from here how a bishop can be favorable to a knight under certain conditions. The bishops being long-range pieces, white's bishop is doing a lot of damage to black on the other side of the board, whereas the black knight is struggling to be relevant. So the rook retreats to cover the back rank, and the rook retreats back to d2, knight e7, and here we see h5, white getting the business on the long diagonal going. Knight f5, hoping to stir things up with the threat of queen h1, but Nakamura plays h6 anyway. And the point being that queen h1 is really not helping because black can't use this knight fork because g7 is hanging and white can take on g7 and just be up a mess of material. So queen h1 not being available, also knight can't move anywhere, of course, because white takes on g7. So Vallejo is looking for a way to somehow slow down this bishop on b2. So he makes this sacrifice with rook takes b2. Note that knight d4 is not exactly an ideal way to try to block the long diagonal, because white can sacrifice straight up or take on g7 first, and then the rook can capture on d4, and that possibly rook takes d4 first is a more accurate way to do it, because then rook takes b2 would not be counter sacrifice. Really the only way to gain any kind of peace of mind on the diagonal is rook takes b2, but of course now white is in line for a material advantage. Now hg7 is an important accurate move, because if white just took right away, then queen h1 is on, and then we see the fork, and that changes everything. But Nakamura had to calculate it exactly. It wasn't that complicated, but after hg7, black doesn't have a good recapture, because if queen takes g7, then that pulls him off h1 anyway. So he takes with the king, but then queen c3, and that kills the threat of queen h1. All right, so black at least gets to outpost this knight on d4. And so at this moment, white has a very clear advantage in material, but there's still some technical problems because his king is wide open. However, it's easy enough to shield it using the rooks, and then we have to look at the open black king, and white is going to attack in that direction. So queen h3, not only killing the check on h1, but the queen can potentially come to h6 and open up some lines there. Rook e6. Rook b6, nice move, giving the b2 square for the king. And another prophylactic move, king b2, getting out of the way of various black checks. Now certainly g6 is on the agenda. And black really has to scramble just to prevent white from breaking down the king side. So queen h6, again trying to force through g6. Rook h2, and black cannot afford to trade rooks with rook e2. White can refute that with queen e6 check, and I think black is getting mated, but also the knight is hanging on e2. So rook e7, and now g6, white forces simplification into an ending where he's simply an exchange up, and he has more than enough pawns to win. One pawn will be enough. because the rook pawn, which is not a good pawn in a lot of endings, is actually an excellent pawn against a knight, because the knight will have a hard time stopping that, and so, the advantage of the exchange will be huge. Now the tactical point is that if black plays rook e2 check, white has takes, queen takes h6, and now rook e8 check. And we see that it's, simply a ladder mate. Black can struggle a bit with king f8, but rook f7, and then rook b8 mate. So, cute little tactic there. And because of that, black is forced to trade queens. And the ending is basically hopeless. There isn't really any counterplay at all. It's the type of thing where white keeps it under control by creating constant mating threats with the rook, forcing black on the defensive. And here, 96, black has to backpedal to keep that under control. And then white is just in a position to start advancing the passed pawn. Well, already there's not very much black can do. So that pawn moves forward. The rook at the moment is tied down to the knight. And knight c7. Now here probably rook g7 check is a bit more obvious than the move played, either trading rooks or forcing a pin on the knight on c7. But, for whatever reason, Nakamura preferred rook a7. It really doesn't make a whole lot of difference. Rook e7. The pawn continues to advance. King e8 hoping for a desperate knight check, fork to do something. But rook b7. Of course, black can't take the pawn. White trades and then takes the knight on a6. King f7. Rook c6. Check. And now king c4. It's clear that white is just going to queen a pawn in a few moves. Probably black could have even resigned somewhat before this, but he did so now. So big win for Nakamura as he made his way closer to the top of the cross table. Of course, the next time he played Vallejo, things did not go so well, as Nakamura overstepped the time limit under very unusual conditions, apparently thinking that the arbiter had told him that he'd made the time control, and then simply not making his 40th move in a position where, he was a pawn up and could make his 40th move rather simply. But in the first half of play, at any rate, Nakamura got the best of Vallejo in this very complicated game. All right, well, that wraps things up. I hope you enjoyed that game. I'm Joel Benjamin, and as always, it's a pleasure for me to bring the show to you. I hope that you'll join me next time on ICC's Game of the Week. Visit www.chess.fm.